I'm Bronwyn Williams, and we're back with a small print. And today our guest is a second-time guest, Velina Tchakarova. And as always on the show, would you please introduce yourself to our listeners for those that are not familiar with who you are and what you do?
Thank you. First and foremost, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure being back on your show. My name is, as you said, Velina Tchakarova. I'm director of the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy based in Vienna, Austria. And yes, I mostly cover geopolitical risks, trends, do strategic foresight, and try to make sense of the global system transformation.
So as you can tell from that introduction, there's not really anyone better than Velina to ask some questions for those of us who don't live so close to Europe with what is going on with the situation with Russia and Ukraine that now seems to be affecting all of us across the world, even here in South Africa, where I am broadcasting from. So Velina, maybe you can catch our guests up, especially for people that are not so close to this on the ground, as to what's actually the current situation going on with the war in Ukraine, because there was a lot of news about it at the beginning of the year. Now the media seem to move on to things like monkeypox and, of course, inflation, which we can come back to, which seems to be closer to home to the average sort of person living a comfortable Western life. But things are still progressing in that part of the world. Life has not gone back to normal, and the ripple effects are going to continue to influence our politics and economics for quite some time. So maybe just catch us up with the current status, and then we can get into some questions about how that's impacting global politics and economics going forward.
Okay, so let me start first with the concrete developments regarding Russia's war against Ukraine. It's been almost 6 months since the beginning of the invasion. And then from there, I will also try to unpack a little bit the systemic dynamics. That means, of course, I will put the regional context into a much broader global context. Now, on the 24th of February this year, Russia started a full-scale war against a sovereign country, that being Ukraine. It was not the first time that Russia invaded actually Ukrainian territory. Reminder for our audience, 2014, with the annexation of Crimea, but also with the military, basically with military involvement and direct actually support of Russian, let's say, Russian military forces on the ground in Ukraine, that being in the eastern parts, which is the so-called Donbass region, consisting of two specific actually regions, Luhansk and Donbass. Now, fast forward, we are 6 months in the war. The large part of eastern Ukraine is already under Russian control. The full actually territory of the Luhansk region, but also 50% of the Donetsk. And in the south, so that means next to the eastern parts, Russia also has actually occupied larger parts neighboring Crimea, obviously with the idea to and the goal to see Ukraine. Ukraine has an access which is critical and strategic to the Black Sea, and Black Sea on its own is the most critical choke point for certain food supply, like, for instance, wheat and other important commodities. And Ukraine, being this very important agricultural exporter, commodities exporter, of course, relies on this access with the main port in Odessa. Now, Odessa is around 80 kilometers away from Kherson, and right now in this critical phase of the war, Kherson is being basically at the center of not just the Russian military operations on the ground in the south, but also as the main goal for Ukrainian counteroffensive. Now, if we take a look at other important parts of the operation, to the west, we have still also military operation around Kharkiv, which is also important in terms of access to natural resources, critical natural resources, minerals, and also specifically energy resources. Now, all put together, this is a critical phase in which, on the one side, sanctions imposed by the West have begun biting the Russian economy. Second important factor is that Western weapons systems deliveries have begun making a difference on the front lines. And third important factor for the moment is, of course, the criticality of attrition war, that being that Russian forces will also have to be replenished, logistics needs to be considered, and so on and so forth. Now, the idea is that the opinion of the experts is more or less split. That means that some experts still think that the war will remain limited to the east and the south of Ukraine. I argue, and there are other voices, that in fact this critical phase of the war will also determine the direction of the war in general in the future, which means that if Russia decides to unilaterally offer a ceasefire to actually the Western powers and not to Ukraine directly, in a sense, it will actually pressure Western leaders, mostly in Europe, to exercise actually their influence on Ukraine, to agree on certain concessions. That means, of course, territorial gains, specifically in the West, will be solidified, but also in the South. But then again, this will be only a break, kind of a freezing of the conflict. And in the next possible moment, probably next year, Russia would strike again. So the war right now is not just about the East and the South, but in general about the complete economic, political, and social subjugation of a sovereign country. Russia needs Ukraine for its larger geopolitical larger geopolitical goal, that is a union with Belarus, with neighboring Belarus, with parts of Ukraine. And then, of course, it will mean that Russia will become the largest geopolitical power in Europe.
So that's what Russia wants. It wants power. It wants a bigger place in world politics. But maybe you can take things back a little bit. Why did Russia start the war 6 months ago? And why did it start it now? Why did it choose the year 2022 as the world is coming out of the COVID pandemic? And we all know all other things that have gone on in the world. Why now? And what was the motivation? What was the big incentive and the reason why they started this?
Exactly. Now we move, of course, from the regional context, that being that we have these three important layers in the decision-making of the Russian president. As I explained, the Ukraine dimension is pretty much clear. In fact, Russia denies the existence of Ukraine, as I said, in political, in economic, and in societal terms. But then again, there are two other important layers in the decision-making. One being, of course, the European context, in which Russia basically has moved from a status quo power towards a revisionist power, a power that tries actually not just to destroy the status quo in Europe, on the old continent, but in fact to unleash a kind of disorder, European disorder. Let's say an analogy to the concept of powers from the 19th century is in fact good news for Russian interests. Why? Because then Moscow can navigate through different capitals, different fluid formations, and of course capitalize by actually playing off European powers against each other. We already observed certain cracks in the European coherent approach. Just to give you one example, now with, of course, the ongoing conflict regarding Russian supply, some Russian energy supply, some European powers are still very much dependent on it. Specifically, of course, it's about gas supply. And that means that European governments will be under political pressure in front of their own population to actually come up with short-term solutions instead of focusing on the long-term actually solution, that is to cut off or diversify. And because of that, Moscow will be using this as a leverage, for instance, to, let's say, lessen sanctions, or even lift certain sanctions, like it happened with the embargo of, let's say, wheat exports, by blocking the ports and by actually not allowing Ukrainian wheat to reach its clients. It in fact achieved a political success because certain Russian banks have to be removed from the list of sanctions. Now, next to the European, of course, layer, and here, of course, the main idea is that on the 24th of February, Russia, in fact, launched also commodities war against Europe. I think that the assessment was, and here it is important to understand that neither the European energy crisis that was already ongoing last year, nor the more general inflation situation were in fact caused by Russia.
No.
So
it
the
was
cause
maybe
was
exacerbated, but certainly not
they
the
were
primary
exacerbated.
cause. As much as we would like a convenient scapegoat there, we'd already put the actions in place that would inevitably result in that. Yes.
Exactly. So the point here is that the geoeconomic context in Europe, and then I will move, of course, next to the more systemic context, but let me just stay a little bit longer on that one. So the idea was, of course, to use the geoeconomic context, ongoing energy crisis, skyrocketing commodities. There you go. You have a perfect recipe, so to say, for political disaster, for political pressure.
A weak spot with which to bite onto.
Exactly. And this was, of course, considered, this was a major difference to actually the context in the 2014 invasion. And in that sense, of course, Russian president decided to amplify and to use this geoeconomic context. And so far, it has, in fact, been playing in the hands of the Russian elite. Why? Because Western sanctions were indeed the most severe ones introduced ever against Russia. That is out of question. However, if the Western sanctions were the necessary condition, the international isolation of Russia, that would mean, of course, no trade, no support whatsoever from countries like China, India, but also other Asian, African, and Latin American partners, that would have been the sufficient condition for the success of these sanctions, and the sufficient condition is not given. Now, going back to the systemic layer, that is the third important layer of the decision making, I also argue that, in fact, we need to place the Russian invasion of Ukraine into the broader systemic context. And that was, I think, the most overlooked layer since the beginning of the war. Now, if we would consider the period between the First and the Second World War as a kind of an interruption, as a kind of a break of a continuum of the two world wars, I argue that the same can be said about the period between the First and the Second Cold War. And I argue that Russian invasion of Ukraine was a manifestation of the beginning of the Cold War 2.0. What do I mean by that? I think that the Russian president also sought to trigger, to exacerbate the systemic competition between United States and China. And in sense, it pressured the decision, to start a full-scale war, because let's be very clear about it. Russian President Putin went the bank all in on Ukraine. It could have been a different decision with a limited war in certain parts of Ukraine, like it is right now the case. But in fact, he went all in, and he miscalculated hugely because in the West, around Kiev, he did not succeed. In fact, the Russian troops were pushed away. But in fact, he pressured, by doing so, he pressured China to actually side with Russia, to overtly and explicitly side with the aggressor. And that, of course, had huge political, mostly geopolitical implications for the Chinese elite, for Xi, and also for, of course, Chinese interests around the globe, resulting 6 months later in the most severe Taiwan crisis that we have observed in most recent times. So by amplifying the systemic competition between China and United States, Russia, in fact, sought pole position. Russia wants to be this indispensable wild card in the systemic rivalry between Beijing and Washington, namely because neither the one nor the other would actually win the systemic competition without the clear political, or let's say geoeconomic, or even, if you like, military support of Moscow. So that, I think, was also the calcul, the rationale behind the decision, and there were plenty of steps in preparation for it. Now, we of course can argue that, well, seen from Chinese or US perspective, things look very differently on the ground, but I think that more or less the invasion of Ukraine was the manifestation of the Cold War 2.0, and there is no turning back. We should now, of course, take a look at the main systemic trends which were amplified by it, which are also, to wrap them up in a few sentences. First and foremost, the decoupling is now actually something that is not just a trend, but is a reality, even to the common eye of daily observers. So the systemic decoupling between China and United States has been further triggered and amplified. Basically, the bifurcation of the global system, that means the system splitting in two parts, is now like I predicted, is now taking place at all layers of societal, let's say, life. You see this bipolarization in societies. You see this bipolarization in political elites, but you're also seeing the bifurcation, the bipolarization at the layer of globalized networks. Just to give you an example, the supply chains reconfiguration, global trade, global economy, energy. So it's everywhere. Then, of course, we have the situation of increasing tensions in the regional centers of power. And the most significant one being, of course, tensions between the two Asian giants. We are going to witness in this Indo-Pacific decade a significant competition between China and India, with India being projected to become the next large economic power in the world. And then, of course, what we also have been observing, and I think it's also very much related to this, to these events and developments, is the US withdrawal from certain parts of the world because of prioritization, because it's going to be the Indo-Pacific decade. The US will no longer play a key role in specific parts. What do I mean? In the short term, the clear example is West Asia, that being mostly the Middle East, but also, parts of let's say North Africa, and we are already observing what the outcome of it is. Like, for instance, this fluid geopolitical constellations between the main actors being Israel, Saudi Arabia, now Turkey, and of course Iran. Then, of course, these fluid ad hoc geopolitical constellations are going to spread all over the globe. That means also actors trying to navigate in this complex decoupling, in this basically bifurcation, while not taking sides with the one or the other rival, while trying to come up with exit strategies, or even better said, with hedge strategies. Just not to side, because siding with the one or the other will be too overt and would mean, of course, also direct implications for the foreign security policy, but also for, trade and economic ties.
Is neutrality an option for a lot of countries, or for which countries is neutrality an option? So take India, for example, that you mentioned them. Where do they stand on what's going on with Ukraine at the moment? Have they put any pegs or any lines in the sand as to who they're backing and who they're not? And the other sort of part of that question is, when you get to this thinking about, can you take a side or not, or is neutrality even an option? It is a bit reminiscent of the US's position in, as you mentioned also earlier, the First and Second World Wars, where they tried to take a neutral position but ended up very firmly on one side by the end of it, and by essentially picking the right winner ended up dominating the next century. So do you see anyone else playing that sort of strategy of playing the neutral, but only neutral until we can kind of see our way clear to the future, and then we can pick the right side kind of a country? So the first part, is neutrality an option for a lot of those sort of West Asian, and even if you want to put in like African or Central nations that aren't neatly either West or East? And then is anyone using neutrality as a strategy rather than actually as a principle?
Well, let's start with the neutrality as a concept being based in Vienna, Austria. Austria is a neutral country. It does not allow foreign military bases. It does not send military, let's say, military aid, for instance, now to Ukraine. It hasn't been sending military aid, military assistance, or any weapon systems. And also, it's not allowed to join any military alliances. Just to put it in a very short in a very short response, what neutrality as a concept, derived from the time of the Cold War, means nowadays. Well, the main question, of course, would be whether neutrality, the way a country understands it and the way the country actually perceives it, is also being perceived the same way by allies, partners, and competitors. That is the first, I think, main question. And the very fact that, just to give you also a concrete example from reality, the very fact that Austria, as a neutral country, joined the European Union in 1995, together with two other neutral countries, being Sweden and Finland, actually shows that during that time, and the European Union is not a military alliance, it's not a defense alliance, it's actually the largest trade bloc, but it was a symbolic act of the three neutral countries to join together the largest trade bloc. And now, fast forward in 2022, two of these three neutral countries decided, in fact, to join the defense alliance, NATO, the transatlantic alliance, which gives us a clue about the understanding how neutrality works in the 21st century. Also, it gives us an idea that neutrality is probably not, the right way of preserving territorial integrity, safeguarding security interests, and
it's a
also
privilege, right? It's a privilege that's available only to those who don't have any material or physical threats to their sovereignty, right?
Indeed, and we often are called the island of the blessed here in Austria. We call ourselves that way, and also are being a little bit perceived like that by the surrounding countries, because we are being positioned at the heart of Europe, quite economically developed country, but with little to no contribution to security and defense matters on the old
and
continent.
Yet you're beneficiary of the security and defense measures of the nations that surround you. Yes.
Exactly, and that is the point. So you see that this is one concept of neutrality that, in my view, is outdated, and it will require a serious debate at home with the political decision makers, but also with all relevant stakeholders about the future role of neutrality if if the country really wants to basically secure its territory, borders, and also prevent any possible military attacks in the future. Another example, as I said, is the one of neutral countries deciding to side. And as I said, I think that, of course, with the time, more and more relevant regional players will be confronted with this harsh reality of basically taking either or decisions. Now, when we talk about countries like India, this is very different dimension. Now, India hasn't more or less hasn't pursued an approach of siding during the Cold War. In fact, it was a leader of a non-alignment movement together with other regional players and also small countries. And once again, it is anticipated that maybe if we end up with a scenario of a Cold War 2.0 between China and United States, India would rather pursue that kind of non-alignment. Now, the question, of course, is would India's new positioning in the world allow actually a non-alignment movement, or actually not siding with any with any of the sides. Now, obviously, there is currently, if we look at the developments on the ground between the Chinese and the Indian elite, there is an effort to kind of mitigate the growing conflict, be it political or, like I said, military, because I argue that in a series of, let's say, geoeconomic developments right now, the Chinese leadership has been pressured to act because of the internal dynamics with the failed zero-COVID policy, with the now sudden Taiwan crisis. There may be a situation in which the Chinese leadership, ahead of the Congress of the Communist Party, would see a window of opportunity, or let's say would be incentivized to actually make a move on the line of actual control, as it happened in 2020, in order to actually draw the attention of the population to a foreign policy event. And that, as you know, always worked to gather the attention and to also basically, draw the attention away from the internal problems. On the side of India, of course, this is not the best timing. And India, as I said, the Indian elite was, in fact, eager to somehow mitigate these tensions because right now we are still in a post-pandemic world. And the main goal is, of course, economic growth and stabilization of the domestic situation. But in a broader context, India will have to deal with some, hardcore questions, security questions, like the one being how to navigate in the growing Indo-Pacific context, where on the one side, China has become very assertive and has pursued a kind of, what I say, twofold rimland, heartland strategy, growing its military presence in the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean region, but on the other side also creating land connectivity with the help of Russia in the large Eurasian space, and basically, trying to somehow encircle Indian geoeconomic interests from the land and also from the sea. So in this sense, would it be enough to create and forge strong partnerships and alliances? And this is the main question, without siding, for instance, with the United States and with the other American allies. And in that direction, we see already actually clear signs that India is, in fact, more active. Like, take the example of the Quad format, the quadrilateral format, which, even though that it's not institutionalized, it clearly entails discussions also on security matters, and it clearly also facilitates, for instance, military drills. So in that sense, partners like Australia and Japan, next to United States, are going to be relevant for India's interests and also partnerships in the future. Then again, other, of course, important questions will be how to reconfigure the supply chains away from China towards India. And once again, a certain siding will be required. So certain positioning will be required. So I argue that India would probably go the third way, in a sense, sense, the third way being that there will be no overt alliance, but like with the United States, but it will be more or less a strongly intensified, intensified partnership with American allies and partners. And here, of course, the main question will remain the strategic partnership with Russia in the future.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting. And what are your thoughts on America itself? America's always been self-interested, and it seems to be generally assumed that America is aligned with the EU and with the general West. Is this likely to continue into the future as the local and domestic politics in the United States are obviously under their own whole waves of change at the moment? Can Europe rely on America as a partner going forward, or is that a very stupid question for me to ask? I just do have questions.
Well, if you had asked the question like just several years ago, the answer would have been very different from the answer right now, and probably the answer will be once again very different in 2 years from now, when once again there will be presidential election. So you see that actually with well, let's say, depending on the US administration and depending on who the US president is, the answer to this question varies. But obviously, here there are two main approaches to the transatlantic relationship. One coming from the Democrats as they base their understanding of alliances and partnerships on actually further institutionalization. So they have already during the time, the administration of Obama launched this myriad of regional initiatives and partnerships in the field of trade, economic ties, but also, of course, given the military cloud. And once again, now during Biden's administration, these specific ties have been strengthened. So I wouldn't even be surprised if there would be a proposal once again for the TTIP, that being the trade partnership between the United States and the European Union. So that would mean, of course, a larger trade bloc between Washington on the one side and the European Union of 27 members. That means the common market. So this kind of institutional approach is typical for Democrat president. But then again, I mean, if there is going to be a Republican president in just 2 years from now, and now with the midterm elections also pointing to actually victory of of the Republicans for both houses, once again this institutional approach is being questioned. So the improvement of the relationship between Europe and America could once again witness a phase of let's say deterioration, because European Union, NATO, respectively European Union, America, so Washington relations could actually be hindered by the introduction of bilateral approach. Because once again, of course, as we've seen from the Trump era, there will be, an incentive to deepen relations only with those loyal partners in the world that have proven actually to be an asset for U.S. interests. And by the way, U.S. does not make an exception when it comes to national interests derived approach. China, Russia, India, all of the relevant players will be acting in the same way. There is no altruism in geopolitics. So even though that, of course, in the West there is this concept of values based approach and the concept of shared values and norms.
How
and
strong
rules.
is that when the economy's balance is changing so much? Because that's what we have to be aware of. Like Europe, in terms of being a global economic power, doesn't have quite the same position globally as it did in the last century. In the next century, as you say, India, China, various different African powers even are probably going to, if they are to form some sort of alliance, could compete with Europe economically speaking, not right now, but looking a bit further ahead. And that does sort of beg the question as to whether alliances based on values will hold in very changing economic pressures. I mean, if Russia does scoop up more interest or is able to take on more territories and gain more economic powers and form strong alliances with China and perhaps even in India, suddenly you've got a very different world order, and the incentives as to who to align with can be quite easily adjusted. At a political level, it's quite easy to see how values follow value as opposed to really the other way around. So we have to take a slightly cynical approach to all of this.
Indeed, because in the end, values are also imposed by force. And in fact, the whole values system that has emerged after 1945 and has been further developed and propagated after the end of the Cold War was only possible because of the US global power projection, and also because of the American alliances and partnerships, and with now the emergence of other relevant competitors, systemic competitors, but also regional competitors. Once again, the question here that, in my view, arises from European point of view is how to actually protect a global geoeconomic cloud, which Europe still, of course, still has. So I argue that Europe will never be a geopolitical actor, the European Union and the member states. Why? Because if they do not become a relevant security actor, not just in the eyes of the competitors, but in fact for the sake of the partners and allies, it will never be perceived as a power that is able and willing to protect its geoeconomic cloud. And that, of course, now brings us back to the question of supporting Ukraine, because right now there is this significant conflict within European governments between the so-called peace party and on the other side, of course, the war party. And as you can guess, of course, the peace party argues that one needs to actually talk to Russia and try to, arrive at a peace with Russia, while the other, the war party, argues that one needs to, in fact, assist Ukraine to win against Russia, because otherwise the whole continent will see a phase of disorder and chaos. And as I said, for Russia becoming, turning from status quo power into a revisionist power, disorder and chaos is good news. But for, of course, the European powers that, in fact, have, more or less tried to preserve the institutional heritage after the end of the Cold War, and also the geoeconomic cloud, without actually having skin in the game, basically meaning protecting even its own neighborhood to the south and to the east. It means bad news, because it would mean that in a state of disorder, and given the trend which I outlined of US withdrawal from certain geographic spaces, and next to West Asia, I think that the old continent will be the space to witness such withdrawal in the long term, because of the prioritization of the Indo-Pacific. So of course that also means bad news. So in a sense, going back to your question about the relationship, if we look at this context in the long run, in the next 3 to 5 years, with US refocusing on the Indo-Pacific, trying to forge new partnerships and strengthen existing ones in the region, like we saw with the AUKUS, with Great Britain and Australia. I see a major cleavage, and once again, bifurcation is probably the key word for it, between the continental European powers and the Anglosphere powers within the West. That means specifically when it comes...
Yes. Post-Brexit too. I mean, all these sort of cracks have been around.
So basically, depending on the outcome of the war, I see this major cleavage, and it will, of course, widen if Russia is successful in the war, which is why I do not understand that there is no sense of urgency in the continental European powers like Germany or France or even Italy, that how important this is not just for Russia and Ukraine, but for them. Because if this gap widens, that brings me to your question. Then, of course, the whole relationship with America will be hindered and will be negatively impacted, because the United States will focus on those European powers, and there will be a bifurcation also along the American, not just the Russian or Chinese geopolitical interests on the old continent, because America will focus on specific European powers that are willing to actually play this, loyal role, role of a loyal partner for American interests. And then again, the rest will be pressured, to come up with an alternative if they don't want to side in this growing competition. And if they don't want to side, they need to come up with, a concept that is, that is strong enough to convince other powers and players in the global, in international relations, that it is credible. And I don't think that credibility can be derived from the lack of military force and hard power.
I wanted to pick up on that. That was one thing that I wanted to get into with you today before we run out of time. And that is your thoughts on the relative powers and strengths between cold and hot warfare, or between boots on the ground invasions and economic warfare. Because there was a sense, particularly when the Russian invasion started in Ukraine, that it was almost quite an old-fashioned thing to do, that actual physical invasions with troops on the ground was a very sort of 20th century way of accruing power for your nation. And then, in fact, really since the world wars, and even through the world wars, the real winners have been people that have been playing, or countries that have been playing, the economic domination game. I mean, America has dominated through its economic, sort of colonization of the world, even now with its inflation. I mean, like, from a very cynical perspective, we can say that American money printing is really just sort of colonization via inflation, right? You can print money, you can use it to buy other people's assets up. But what I have found interesting, listening to everything that you've said, is that, like the old adages go, like, money can buy force, but force can just take money. And what Russia has reminded us is that what really matters and where real power lies is still in the real world, right? And the strength of the dollar was actually backed on that threat of real force, which America only used really on the fringes, only really used to defend economic interests. It didn't really use to physically colonize other states. But I do think it's quite interesting that what Putin has done is really put focus back onto real rather than nominal control of markets and minds and nations, and that it's a focus on energy, on food, on physical threats, which is something that the West hasn't really experienced for quite a long time. This was something that happened in kind of backwater nations, like in developing parts of the world. It happened over there, it didn't happen over here. And I think it's quite a powerful move for a essentially developed market leader to remind people just how fragile society is, and how economic control, which Europe had much more of than Russia, means very little in the face of physical force. So I did want to get your thoughts on that. So I think it's a real interesting tipping point. As a trained analyst, we're seeing a lot of this too. I mean, I'm sure you've heard the conversations around reality privilege, how reality is now the privilege, or Cathy O'Neill's quotes, in the future, the privileged are processed by people and the masses by machines, and this idea that essentially real is where it's at. As much as we want to convince ourselves we live in very sanitized, digitized, financialized societies, at the end of the day, the guy that's pointing the biggest guns at your at your children's heads is the one who has the real power in the world. And not all leaders are willing to actually play that card. America plays a lot of chicken in that regard, but Putin just did it. What are your thoughts there? I don't know if I've made any sense with that point, but I just think it's a very interesting, almost revision or pendulum swing back to focusing on the real.
Well, first and foremost, I would like to stress that Russia's war against Ukraine has been in the making for the last at least 8 years. It did not come out of surprise. It did not come out of the sudden. And in fact, Russian president has been preparing for this war, as I said, for quite some time now. It could be seen, of course, as a next stage of, series of developments and processes within the dissolution of the Russian Empire, if you like, from the last 250 years, and also as the next stage of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, if you like, after the collapse of the Soviet Empire in the 90s. And of course, it is an existential war for the Russian president personally, and also for the Russian elite. So it will depend, so their fate will depend also on the outcome of this war. War, once again, is, a continuation of peace, and the very fact that 75 years peace on the old continent did not actually last longer, probably is one of the longest periods of, peace in the most modern times. But once again, it's illusional to think if there is a European decision maker who still believes that, but it's delusional to think that there will be the European security order as we knew it before 4th February, that this European order is coming back, because that is not going to happen. And as I said, we are now entering a phase of disorder in one way or another. Now, then again, of course, if you take a look at the war as means to, to solidify geopolitical and geoeconomic gains, well, take a look at the map and see where the natural resources, minerals, and also, energy resources lie in Ukraine. And there you go. You will find once again that a lot of the territories where currently there are actually military operations within the full scale war by Russia. These are territories that, in fact, entail a lot of critical resources, which are important for Russia, equally, of course, for Ukraine. And once again, it is, in fact, a war, as it was the case with most of the wars, that actually aims at subjugating the territory because of the access to critical resources. Now, once again, I need to stress that Black Sea is not just another sea, but it's actually, the global choke point for wheat and other critical food commodities. And given the fact that Russia could extend its influence and its presence in the Black Sea is, in fact, significant. But if you take a look at the map and see how the vertical expansion of Russian geopolitical and geoeconomic interests has developed over the last, let's say, decade, you will find that closing the chapter on Ukraine would solidify this vertical expansion, starting from the Arctic and the Barents Sea, and then moving along the so-called eastern flank of NATO, which is actually the western flank of the military forces of Russia, with the largest, let's say, concentration of population of Russian population, and then moving towards critical Central Asian, Eastern European, and South Caucasian parts of geographic space, connecting also, or let's say solidifying the Russian control over the Black Sea, Caspian Sea, and then of course the Mediterranean. And if we go even further, you will actually realize that this military presence is now expanding also along the littorals of Africa, specifically in eastern and also some central parts of African countries. So there is a logic behind these actions. And in order, like I said, to do so, you need to close this chapter on Ukraine. You need to make a move right now. But, then again, of course, as seen from the European perspective, the European powers perspective, the very fact that the main European powers were not able to prevent the war from happening. Of course, they reacted accordingly. Of course, they launched severe sanctions and are now assisting Ukraine by all means. No doubt about it. But the very fact that they did not prevent the war tells us also a story. And that is the story that in this world, you need to prepare for war if you want peace. It's the old classic realpolitik paradigm that I think that European powers, with few exceptions, being UK and France, have forgotten for quite some time now, and now they're coming back to this realization that you cannot act post-war because someone else has taken the decision for you and has impacted hugely your own, not just your own geographic space, but your own positioning in this geographic space by just launching the war. So which once again brings me to the point that it's an existential war, not only for the Russian president and for Russia, but it has become an existential war for the European powers, because if Ukraine loses the war, Europe, I argue, will become the geopolitical backyard of global affairs in this century.
That's a really powerful statement. And there's one more question that I wanted to ask you before we finish off, and we're almost at the end of our hour. And that's the question around China. Has what Russia has done now changed or accelerated China's strategy? Because China's strategy for the last few decades has been very much its Silk Road initiative. It's been a lot about economic power and building economic networks and economic domination onto weaker countries and expropriating resources in that regard. But does this change China's strategy to be a more militant, aggressive one? I mean, there's a lot of speculation around parallels between Taiwan and Ukraine. I know the situation isn't exactly the same, but does this change China's strategy, or is China likely to stick with a more economic global strategy, or are they likely to follow in a similar strategy to Russia?
Indeed, it has changed China's, let's say, standing in the global affairs, but also China's approach to international relations. I think that the masks are off, and China, and this is what I argue, that basically the Russian president accelerated and triggered, namely to basically for China to overtly admit to this systemic competition. Now, given also the fact, given the internal dynamics, there are objective ones and subjective ones in a post-COVID scenario in which China is still very much, the Chinese elite is still very much struggling to basically deal with the pandemic, with the failed COVID-0 policy, with the reintroduction of lockdowns. This will have devastating impact on Chinese economy, and in fact the long-awaited economic growth is not coming back, on the opposite, and that all, of course, put together means bad news for the Chinese establishment, because internal stability, the domestic cohesion, this is actually priority number one for China, and not, of course, the competition with the United States or any other foreign policy adventure. So foreign policy adventures are actually a function of the success of the Chinese elite to keep the system afloat and to keep stability at home. So against this background, I think that Chinese leadership, and now it became obvious with the Taiwan crisis, basically that the leadership was triggered to act, to show military muscle, to show strength ahead of the Congress of the Communist Party, even though that it would have not been necessary to, to overreact in that way. And in a sense, now it speeded up the Chinese reaction to relevant international issues. That means it's going to be very, very difficult for the Chinese leadership to scale down and to, go back a few steps in terms of military de-escalation in this part of the world, but also in other parts of the world where there are strong Chinese geoeconomic interests. So that means that we close that chapter. And now we opened a new chapter of, like I said, overt competition. And that does not necessarily mean that it will end in a direct confrontation. Two powers can arrange, for different reasons, of course, also kind of systemic coexistence. And this is my best case scenario, systemic coexistence. That's why Cold War 2.0. But then again, there will be hotspots like the one in Taiwan, like the one along the line of actual control, but also in other parts, like in, for instance, Afghanistan, where there are major so to say, interests involved. And finally, of course, the diplomatic two-front scenario that of linking, the linkage between Ukraine and Taiwan. I think that this was also something that more or less was triggered by the Russian position, was carefully prepared by the Russian position. It was not necessarily something that the Chinese leadership wanted to play as a card, but now, of course, being pushed to the wall, they will be going for this. And I explicitly say diplomatic and not military, because I think I still am not convinced that we are going to witness military attack on Taiwan prior to the Congress of the Communist Party. It is
the motivations are different. The one's about defense and retention, and the other one's about offense and expansion, right? So it's like it looks similar, but it's very different underlying motives.
Exactly, which is why I still argue that we probably will see a different scenario, a different approach to Taiwan in general, but that does not exclude, of course, crisis from time to time, military escalation, crisis like the one we've observed recently. Once again, it does not necessarily mean that we will end up in a direct confrontation between the two powers, but a lot of proxy wars, a lot of hotspots along the intersection of the peripheries of power projection of the one and the other actor. And as I said, in this space in between, a lot of regional actors trying to oscillate and maximize their gains by playing the one against the other.
Yeah, absolutely. We've covered a lot of ground. I think that the key takeaway from everything you've been saying is that if you want peace, you do need to prepare for war. And this applies to any of the major characters that we've covered today, whether it's a China that's hands been forced, or whether it's a Europe that's got to decide to fight for its future or not, or whether it's a country that's just trying to defend itself from literally being invaded. We have to always be on our guard. Civilization is not guaranteed, and the values that got us here, unless we value them, are not guaranteed to get us to where we're going yet. So as you say, the world is in a bit of an existential crisis at the moment, and how this turns out will have far-reaching implications for all of us and for the overall geographic world order. But thank you so much, Velina, for being so generous with your time. And where can people find you if they want to pick up this conversation or work with you in the future?
Well, thank you for having me on your show. Once again, it's been a pleasure. You can find me on Twitter on Tchakarova, or you can just send me an email on, via my webpage, which is www.velinatchakarova.com.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and rate us on all your preferred podcast platforms. If you'd like to find out more about what we're doing, please join our Substack community via the link in the comments below. And as always, we'd love to hear your suggestions for future guests and conversation topics.